Yeah, we got. Okay. So, hi, how are you? Good.
Okay, we begin with the pledge of allegiance.
Yes, please.
Pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Turn the meeting over.
Okay, thank you very much. So thank you, Planning Board, for having us. I'm Sarah Wall-Ballinger. This is Heather Ellison Waters. We are technically the co-chairs of the Comprehensive Planning Committee, which is working on a comprehensive plan for the town of Manlius, as you know. And we're here today to go over a few background slides as far as where we are at now in the process. It's been just over a year since we first started. And then we're going to have some dialogue with you with regard to what impacts this might have on planning, zoning, building related things that are of interest to this committee, and how the kinds of things that have come before you that we should be considering in the plan to sort of maybe mitigate things that have been problematic or new trends that you've observed that we should make sure we keep in mind. So if I could start the slides, we'll just. And this is on Zoom as well. We have some Zoom attendees as well. So if you want to go right on to the next one. So the comprehensive plan is generally has sort of 4 chapters to it. So we want to have a where we are now part, a where we hope to go in the future, a how we're going to get there. So those are sort of the phases of it. And we've been spending the whole past year in the where are we now part, and we're just getting to the where do we want to go part. And we wanted to be sure that there was a communication strategy around understanding what the vision and the purpose is, so that if we do make a change in a zone or a regulation, that people understand that it's connected to this bigger goal, and that we're making sure that those connections are clear and not muddy. So we want to make sure that that's one of the things we get from you, is that these are the kinds of things that are confusing to residents, and we want to make sure we're really clear about them. So the next slide is just in terms of the reference of where we are. We're not an island. There's other comprehensive plans going on or have gone on. Fayetteville is currently updating theirs, and the Onondaga County is updating theirs in something called Plan On. So we're trying to make sure we coordinate any bigger vision goals with what the other communities are planning. And then the benefits of it is partly to have, next slide, funding. Is if we have a comprehensive plan and there's a goal in the plan, it makes it much easier to apply for state grants to say, we set, the community decided they wanted to do this thing, this is the direction we're going in, and then we could get funding to do something if it were to preserve a green space or improve a stormwater system or something, that if it was part of the plan, it would be easier to get funding for it. So that's one of the reasons for doing it. Another reason for doing it is to communicate with developers, to try to help them understand this is the vision of where we are hoping a particular part of the town or a particular area would be. And then a developer can say, oh, that's the kind of thing I like to build, and come here and do that. Or they might say, oh, clearly the thing I wanted to build is not what they want here, and I'm going to have a harder time. So just to kind of help communicate in advance to developers, instead of always being reactive and just saying whatever you come with, if it's another bank or coffee shop, we just stuck with whatever it is you want to do. And say instead, what we're really looking for is banks and coffee shops over in this area, and if that's what you'd like to build, please come here and do that. So it's sort of just a different approach to the sort of the same end maybe, but it's just, we're hoping to be a little bit more proactive. So quickly on the next slide, we're still not there. So Arnie, you asked earlier, like when will we be over? We're not really expected to be over until spring. But we are in this phase of developing a draft now. So your input will be timely in the sense that it's developing a draft. The other thing to let you know is that the grant we did get in 2021 for 2022 added a component that's also during this time frame, that's a zoning analysis. And so a parallel track is over the summer, we're going to get a zoning analysis and a build out analysis, which will take our existing zoning and do some like samples or diagrams of, with this space, this is what could go there. Is that really what you want? So a lot of times people say, you know, everything else in this neighborhood is a car dealer. I'm assuming other things would be a car dealer. And then you find, oh, no, it's not a car dealer. It's actually a huge retirement community. You know, so it wasn't what I expected to go in there. And, but it was permitted. So that's what you get. So the idea is to say, look at all of these things that could be permitted. And do you want your zoning to be more restrictive and maybe only permit some of those things, but not all those things? And then the initial, so what we did is we identified the policy goals. So I'll go over this a little bit quickly, but we know we're going to have something about environmental sustainability. We're going to definitely have things about community identity and quality of life. So those are things that pretty much all strategic comprehensive plans have. We're going to talk about housing, neighborhoods, how to be welcoming, maybe something about accessibility. Some things like that have come up in the neighborhood section. We want to support local commerce. So while we don't want to say that there should never be a chain, we also want to make sure we're friendly to homegrown businesses. We want to talk about modern transportation. So right now, suburbs are generally very car-centric. We want to make sure we're considering pedestrian and bicycle traffic, public transportation, other kinds of options in the transportation realm. And then the final one is responsive government operations, which really has to do with communication, stuff on our website, newsletter. How do we make sure the residents actually know what their rules are before they might get in trouble for something because they didn't know how to find out what the rules were. On the right side of the slide are just all the different public meetings that we've had so far. And then we will add this meeting to it at the end. And we're continuing, we're going to do a public meeting on September 20th at the Fayetteville Library that's open to the general public for just a community input session on the 6 goals that we have identified and some of the preliminary objectives that the steering committee has put together.
Now, like for example, renters focus group. What did you do with that?
So we went to an apartment building and talked to some people there. So it's not scientific. It's just the people who happened to show up shared what their perspectives were as renters. Because our initial survey was 99% homeowners. So we said, well, we should hear from some people that are not homeowners. And so we did a focus group with some renters.
Quarry study group.
So the Quarry study group was a group of about a dozen people altogether who met 4 times and had guest speakers on issues related to quarry development.
What is quarry development?
Building a new quarry.
Kinsella.
Okay,
Kinsella's
so building, okay.
They like.
And we did the same thing with stormwater. There were 4 meetings, we had guest speakers.
Yeah, okay, good.
Any other questions about
Yeah,
this?
can you explain what you meant by housing, neighbors, and acceptability? I didn't quite get that.
So accessibility, I may have mispronounced.
What did you say?
Accessibility.
Oh, accessibility, thank you, because that's clear.
Yeah, that's what
That's a can of worms.
Change that, no.
Thank you for clarifying it.
Yes.
I was never, yeah, so
Thank you.
we want to have, make sure that we have accessible housing that's accessible, both transportation wise and also disability wise.
Gotcha, okay, thanks.
Can I ask questions to direct?
Sure.
and wait?
Hmm?
Direct, I
You don't
can
have to
ask
wait,
them.
will you?
What about disaster readiness or emergency readiness?
So this is actually a land use plan.
Okay.
So Does it, we do have a group that works on that,
Land, okay, so
yeah,
that-
but what's
That makes
the critical, what's it called?
Critical response.
Critical,
CRC.
so we,
That's a big thing and it's someplace else.
yeah, but but we're part, I mean, we do that and we talk
But
regularly,
it's not part of this. the
It's not part of this thing.
Plan is mostly for land.
land use, yeah.
Okay.
So we did, I don't know if you guys are familiar with the settlement plan, it's about 10 years old now.
The what?
The settlement plan that some of 2001, not 10 years old, 20 years old. It's a county document, but they did like ideal zoning, and they had some mucky muck come and talk about different zoning areas. So that's one of the guidance about sort of how to revamp your zoning to be more current. We had a speaker last week who spoke about sort of streetscape and bringing nature into your zoning more. This whole, you guys may have heard about the effort to naturalize the art instead of having lawns, is to be able to let wildflowers grow and things like that. So just how to make your code maybe permit that, but maybe not let it get out of hand. And, you know, trying to have your zoning be a little bit more flexible about natural environments. One of the big things is what is called smart growth, is developing where your infrastructure already is. So trying not to keep extending water and sewer further out, but to infill where development already is, so that you are reducing the strain on town resources. And then the reverse of that is to then where areas that are open space and green is to keep them that way. So to try to keep agriculture as agriculture and to keep forest as forest, because as much as possible, so that you try to keep development with development and natural with natural. But then the other people say, but then bring natural into the development. So
What is infill development?
that's building where infrastructure already exists.
Oh, that's it.
So then the next slide is the zoning assessment. I think I jumped ahead. So we are doing this review of the zoning. And that will be an addendum to the plan, the written plan that just reviews all of our current zoning and maybe makes some recommendations about areas that could be looked at differently.
How old is that map?
This map is current. It's actually on our website right now.
How old is that one up there?
That one's not current.
I thought maybe, okay.
Which one?
The one on the wall, she was right.
Oh, the wall, yeah. The one the supervisor.
Not much has changed, but once in a while something has.
Well, yeah, I mean, if you're looking at specific property, either right or it's not.
Yeah. So on our website, we actually have a current where you can click the exact property you're interested in and it will tell you. So this was the part I really want to talk to you about. So land uses, some of the stuff that we have been chatting about are these general areas of concern. Density, vehicle-centric, connectivity, transitional uses, and then preserving agriculture and open space. So those are sort of the general areas we want to have a conversation about. So I wanted to sort of open
Trying to
it.
make it bigger. There you go.
There you go. Okay, that makes it a little easier to see.
Yeah.
So if I could be quiet for a little while, and then if we could just talk about what are some issues around density and size requirements that have struck out to you, or that you've had proposals before the planning board that you thought, you know, this was a really great idea, but our zoning wouldn't allow it, or it was a really bad idea and I'm glad our zoning didn't allow it. So I just want to talk a little bit about density and size requirements.
Well, we have in our code, section 278, which permits us to do cluster developments. And that permits us to make the density a little more thicker. But at the same time, it's preserving the natural environment. The intent is that we're gonna have bigger buffers between various developments, because the vegetation is gonna remain there and it's not gonna come down. And the contour of the land should change as little as possible. And we encourage cluster development. Although in one recent lawsuit, we were told that we were ordering cluster development. We did not. But we encourage it because it permits the properties to be more dense. as long as the conventional plan shows a certain number of houses, we will let that certain number of houses be in a smaller, more condensed area, and preserve nature as best we can. So I think to a degree, we can do that. If in fact they need a variance in order to get a smaller lot or things of that nature, they fall in place often, and we would refer them to the zoning board of appeals to get a variance in order to better qualify for some of these things. Yeah.
Where you run into problems, I think, most obviously is originally the idea of a 40,000 square foot lot was to enable a person to have a septic system. And that got to be 1.5 acres, now it's 2 acres, and that goes exactly in the opposite direction that you're trying to go. So one of the things you have to figure out is, do we have the infrastructure in terms of water and sewer to infill? Because if we don't, then we're going to have an awfully hard time keeping the developers out of the places that are nice and wide open. Their problem is bringing the utilities. Cost of that is outrageous. So if we can bring people into infill, we've got to make sure that we have the water and sewer capacity and stormwater capacity to handle it. And that I think is going to be a real challenge. I wish the engineers were here, because we run into this all the time on the planning.
And I think, you don't want places too close together if they're on septic, so.
Right.
Yeah. So a certain lot size is necessary from the septic point of view, and sometimes from the stormwater point of view too. You just need to have enough absorption.
Sometimes even from the drinking water point of view too. This one at Harrington Homes, giving them a really hard time about making darn sure that not only will each house have enough water, but it won't be taking it to the people on Henneberry Road and what's the name of that street that's just below. It's the one block long street that sits underneath the Harrington Homes development. It's already there. It
It's
runs
already
right
there.
off of Henneberry.
Brandywine?
Brandywine. Yep. That's the Brandywine development.
So infrastructure is one of the things. What about the actual home size? What about if you wanted to build an 800 square foot home or whatever?
We have addressed that. Miller's Landing, they wanted to sneak in a couple smaller houses that were, they would depreciate the value of the houses already existing there, and it would be like a non-conforming type of house. And we basically kind of blocked that one. So it said, no, these are too small. They're not appropriate for the neighborhood. It's going to have an adverse impact on the value of the houses that are already there.
As we put it to the developer, would you like to live in that house? Everybody in the planning board said no.
Well, one of the things that that is like really trending now, and it may be just a fad, but it came up in New York State that it was almost passed, is to permit accessory dwelling units, which are basically little in-law houses. So you would have your main house, but then you have this little house too. And those are very popular now.
And they make a lot of sense. But can't they, my thought on that is, instead of having a separate dwelling place that is a separate structure that can be built onto the existing structure, if in fact they're in-laws, then there ought to be access so they can come in and out, and it would appear, for all appearances sake, to be one single structure.
Makes more sense to me.
And I think that would have no adverse impact on anybody.
What about multi-generational homes, or the fact that young people might be looking for a transitional? I mean, is the concern to really make sure that we're not inviting people to have a commercial Airbnb kind of opportunity? Is that one of the concerns that comes up? Or is it something that can be transitional over the life of someone's, ownership of the property, whether it's basically a guest house for themselves, or if it when in-laws come, or a gym or an office or a studio or whatever it is. And then, but many different purposes. I don't think, I think people are quite interested in those options across the country, and it would be good to have it to have some sort of plan, knowing that there'll be demand for them.
One of the areas that has come up is a caregiver unit, so that we're, because one of the common rules is the person has to be related to the person in the main house. But if you're the caretaker of the person in the main house, you're not related. And we did have a situation here in Manlius not long ago where somebody got in trouble for building out like an apartment over their garage for the caregiver. And it wasn't a permitted use, and they ended up having to go through a bunch of hoops to try to get that done. Might have been in the village.
I was gonna say, I don't know if it was.
I think it was in the village. But it was an unfortunate circumstance because here they found a caregiver who was willing to live in, but wanted her own space. And that would have been a good solution, but the code didn't actually permit for an unrelated person to live there.
It should be your basis for exceptions to various rules. And if in fact the owner of the original premises can be certified by a physician that they need a caretaker to provide for them, and they provide paperwork documenting that this is what's going on, I don't see a problem with that.
It's probably hasn't been a problem in town. I don't think. Maybe there's been a village.
In the town, my guess is that people are doing that already.
Yeah.
And there's so many elderly people who have to have caretakers coming in and out of the house that they throw them in an extra room and say, here's a room for you. That'll make life easier for you. People don't object, and I don't think our code file has been sent out to go bother people and things like that.
So I heard that caretaking is an interest. I know that the village will probably be villages will probably be updating their codes. I know that the proposed development on the senior center site or next door was a bunch of smaller, almost tiny home
They were pretty
apartments.
tiny. Yeah. They were
Yeah.
pretty tiny.
And so I wonder if they're, I
Where's
assume
that?
that's gonna be right at the Fayetteville Senior Center.
Oh, down there.
Yeah.
Okay, I didn't know if it was Manlius.
Are they gonna go ahead with those units?
I don't know where it is.
No, they're not.
No, they didn't.
But it was proposed. So.
Oh, you were looking, I'm looking at the language. And is part of the issue that you don't have anything in your code about that kind of housing?
Well, the issue really was that it was again, the density question is the lot really wasn't big enough to support. They were talking about like 8 townhomes and 6 tiny homes in this lot that was like an acre. It just wasn't really trying much. But the idea was we need senior housing, and smaller homes may be easier to take care of, more affordable. It could be a good solution. It would be good to permit smaller homes. And I think depending on the neighborhood, if you're in Mallard's Landing, there's a certain expectation of what the homes are going to look like.
Exactly.
If you're in Homewood, there's a different expectation of what the homes are going to look
But if someone wants to put in a new development and have smaller homes, and the whole development is going to consist of smaller homes of a certain dimension, why is that not appropriate?
Yeah, and I think too, Joe, when I was on the village board, they had, they were looking at patio homes before mineral farms. And a great idea, but the problem is finding the developer that's willing to see if they can get the money for what it's worth to build those patio homes. You know, I mean, it never did happen. Like, we had no farms.
Right.
And then one thing led to another, and now we get the town resort up here. I mean, that started, they were into that Manoa, didn't work out. We actually annexed, the town annexed to the village annexed to the town so that they could have water and sewer there. And then there was a soil concern, so that was shut down. Next thing you know, they have the senior center up here. So it all comes down to availability and the developers, funding of getting these things done, But I think, I agree. I think patio homes, I think the smaller homes, I have a couple right now, they're looking at ranches. They don't need their, 3,000 square foot home
Right.
anymore, And, so, but those things we're always willing to,
I think
if it fits, we certainly would.
I don't think we've ever objected to,
No.
unless it's out of conformity with the existing neighborhood. And
Yeah.
the only one I can think of is Mallard's Landing when we raise that issue.
Was that last section we put in there?
That blue.
6 months.
Yeah, I remember that.
Yeah, so I think that's the role of the planning board, is to monitor for the existing character so that the community doesn't, I mean, even something that you might say was nice is you have, all, 1960s modern, and then somebody puts in a painted Lady Victorian and it just doesn't fit. So, all right, so vehicle-centric policies. So this is another area that we're interested in, is increasing the pedestrian, bicycle, public. And this is, in the village, this is easy to talk about. In the town, there's some longer distances that we're not going to put sidewalks down.
Yeah.
But what are your thoughts? Do you have any thoughts about changing the parking requirements for buildings so that you don't have to have as many cars, don't have to have as much parking, and to utilize more emphasis on trailways and walking paths?
We've been kind of getting around it through the back door.
Mhm.
You need so many vehicles, there's so many parking spaces for so many units.
Right.
But we've been engaged in what we call banked parking.
Okay.
It's parking that is available and that could happen, but that you are not forcing them to do it at this time. We did bank parking with the residential
Right.
with the resort.
Mhm.
And so it's something that's there, and if in fact the facility needs the additional parking, we go forward with it, and we tell them we're reevaluating and you need to move forward with it. But if there's no need to it, if it facilitates all the parking you've got, we do the bank parking.
Okay.
The only thing that we're not in total unison on is where to have parking relative to commercial buildings. My attitude is parking should be behind the commercial buildings for the aesthetic value of things. And I do recall one project where I was the only person who proposed that and thought
The
that way.
problem though with that is the canal.
That's what they said. That's what the builder said. Yes, I agree that he said that.
But you would have liked to see that dentist office be closer.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And instead of having all the parking in front. like
Yeah.
it is now, which-
Yes, a
I don't know, it doesn't,
It is a lot of parking. We
I'm
have
sort of
this,
used to it.
yeah, well, that's it. The presentation we had recently by Professor Carter, he showed us a couple of images that were really fascinating about how there's a retail wrapper around, parking in the center. And so there are these ways of sort of just designing the building in a way that makes the parking accessible, but also raises the aesthetic level like that. And so he showed us that, and he showed us also how some buildings were managing not just having drive-in on one level, but on a two-story building or whatever, finding a way to also keep your corridor looking very inviting and again, more
More
comfortable for pedestrians and for a lot of cyclists, but yet not inconvenient for the.
So one of his examples was the mixed use that we were talking about before, where there's shops on the ground floor, but there was parking on the second floor. Condos on the third. And then condos above that. So that what you ended up with, I can't imagine the fire code on that, but aside from that challenge of the expense, but from the street, if you're walking, you're just seeing the shop windows. But if you're working in the building, there is parking. And so you're not making a huge parking lot. They just have street.
I can see that more in a city setting.
It wouldn't be likely very many places here,
Right.
but it's
Maybe
the
somewhere
concept.
like Highbridge down next to Highbridge Landing or that corner right there, somewhere for villages, I think, too. Something to
Right.
consider.
But I think town center is an example of a vast expanse of parking that really takes away from what could have been a streetscape.
It truly does.
Yeah.
It truly does.
Some of the built out second phase projects, the houses, or excuse me, the offices that are along Burdick attempt to do that, to make it, and so that were something that, I don't know what CORE would be open to, but if they're thinking about the future life of that project, that's an example of what we could encourage. This idea of,
Core is a good builder. they do listen to our advice, and when we make strong recommendations to them to change the layout to accommodate what we believe will be a better appearance of the structure, they listen.
Yeah.
And
Maybe-
Kate Johnson normally comes in for them, and
Yeah, she does great.
she does a very good job of listening and modifying.
Well, and their newer developments, are more addressed in the street, but the problem is that the way that the street and the drainage and everything else is pre-designed,
Mhm.
you can't access it from the street.
That can look like a little bit of a ditch, but at least it's a nice brick building with some green,
Yeah.
instead
They
of
did a
just
beautiful
target
job
parking
landscaping.
lot.
If you've been over there, it looks lovely what they did. Connectivity. So this is something else that was actually new to me because I didn't know that cul-de-sacs were so bad except for plowing, but
Well,
they have other challenges.
when I was at one of the symposiums that we went to a
Mhm.
few years back, that was one of the discussions, was how terrible these cul-de-sacs are. And it's only because accessibility of going someplace. Well, people that want to live in a cul-de-sac want to be there and not bothered by it. So if you have that center
Mhm.
spot, that's the crown point of a cul-de-sac someone is willing to pay for and have a lot of, marketing for them, so. I didn't totally agree with the limitations of cul-de-sacs because it's a sort of a personal choice.
Mhm.
But I know it's more sustainability is what they're looking at. It's more like, I know that there's issues up along Woodbox where there's plowing problems during the winter. And Rob continues to get calls during that time of year because it's like, where do you put it? And that's one of the issues with the cul-de-sac. I think it's more the winter moving of the snow.
Well, that's, the snow plowing is certainly part of it, but I think the way that this came up was more in the shortcuts, that if you have the lot, which is the shortcut to wherever everybody else wants to be, they can cross your lawn.
Right.
If you had grid streets instead, you would have less of
Right.
that. So the idea is to make it so that people could walk or bike through the neighborhood to get to the
And I don't know
library and
how-
the store, or whatever they're going.
I don't know how bad that is though, I mean, if that's really much of an issue other than perception of certain people, but others I know, they when the neighborhood is closely knit,
Mhm.
they're okay with the kids taking the
Mhm.
shortcut, I mean, I know
Right.
that happens up on Acton Street all the time, so it's a sort of a mixed bag there as far
But
as.
I think the planners would say the fact that Mrs. Jones doesn't mind the kids walking through her yard is not the same as making it public access. So.
Well, there is an advantage to a cul-de-sac. I live in a neighborhood where there's 3 of them.
Mhm.
And one of the big advantages is you don't have the crazy people driving through at 40 miles an hour.
Well, you do, but they're your neighbors.
They're all dead ends. So you eliminate the criminal who doesn't like to go into a dead end.
Mhm.
You eliminate the motorcyclists who don't like to drive into dead ends. And if you make the cul-de-sac big enough, this is where the developer gets engaged. He doesn't want to make it too big because it takes away from the lots that are flanking it.
Right.
But it also allows the school bus and plow to go through there and do their stuff nicely.
Cul-de-sacs are more difficult to plow, to maintain.
Mhm.
They have to back forward and backward several times in order to get the whole thing encompassed. So a regular grid for that purpose would be better. I live on a cul-de-sac. And
Right.
You see it all.
That's fine in such good shape. Shove on the driveway.
Yeah, so I think that's gonna be an ongoing conversation with. the
And I think it
grid
might
and
be,
cul-de-sac.
it would be something we would like to have be considered the advantages of the grid streets versus the cul-de-sac. And there may be some neighborhoods where it makes sense to do one versus the other.
Sarah, what would you think of the opening up of Polly Drive, which is now stopped in the middle of a 12-acre piece of ground?
Well, that's an interesting question because I think the primary opposition to that was the grade and the drainage as opposed to the actual connection of the street. But in terms of the specific, in terms of the traffic driving through, I don't think the traffic would be significantly different.
Neither did a traffic control study that we ordered and came and arrived, and they said insignificant impact. It was they were trying to force the houses on the lots, and and say there could be no area for swing sets, it could be no area for swimming pools. They were restricting what future buyers would be able to do with their lots. And they were forcing the issue. And our board was not keen on that at all.
So I think there's, as your experience has pointed out, there are many sort of idiosyncratic things that come up with a particular site that are not necessarily indicative of how you would rule in a different site with a similar circumstance.
Oh, yeah, correct. They vary case by case.
So we talked a little bit about this with the accessory dwelling units, but this is multi-story mixed use, small multiple families, rental communities, and expanded home occupations. I think Heather mentioned it. We just see that home occupations is going to be the wave of the future, that there's going to be a lot more people working at home that do either just are freelancers or they work for a company, but they never go to the company. And just trying to understand better when somebody says it's an R1, like, can you still work for Lockheed Martin and never go there?
Isn't it more of whether to put a shingle up outside your door?
Realistically, that's the only difference.
Yeah.
Most people who are home occupied, they are no different than anyone else on the entire street, unless, of course, they put a shingle outside or you can see the people coming in and out.
Right.
But then we grant the special use permit, and most of them are grandfathered in there
Right.
without a problem.
Yeah.
We've always been
It might be
fair.
different in the village. I don't know if it's different in the village or not.
Agreed.
You would know.
I went to the village in Manoa with an application for a special use permit for a law office. And the guy said to me, "What do you think you're doing?" And I said, "I'm applying for a special use permit to have a law office." He said, "You're opening cans of worms that we don't discuss here."
Oh my
He said,
God.
"Just take your papers and go away and run your business. We don't care." And to a large degree, I think the community ought not care if in fact there's going to be no additional
Right.
traffic on the street. It's a minor concern.
Also, the fact that they don't have to drive, find another parking place and place of work.
Yeah.
I think of all the time that's wasted and all the carbon that's consumed, going back and forth in a useless thing from home to work. Anybody who can work from home, as far as I'm concerned, is a plus.
COVID opened that door, and that door is not closing with the end of COVID. That door is going to remain open, and we're going to have more and more people in that home occupation. And I don't see a problem with that.
So small multifamily, we're thinking of, because two families are already permitted in most places, but would be like 3 or 4 families, getting, not a whole apartment complex, but just having more variety of rental spaces available in the town. We hear a lot from people that there just isn't enough affordable rental units.
I'm not sure what you mean by that. What are the, who's saying?
Residents that
That
are
are
looking for a
living
place to
here now.
live, who say, like 20-year-olds who, I can't leave home, I can't find an apartment that I can live in that's here. I can move to Syracuse, but I can't live here.
Oh, I see. Okay.
So you've got the big homes right out here, right on Main Street.
Yeah.
Which are 3 and 4 family homes. And there's very few others like that.
And they're pretty sought after.
Oh, yeah, and they're always full.
Mhm.
There has been a development over in the Stickley factory. It's,
Oh, yeah.
But those are upscale and bigger. So I think this problem, people would love to live in Manlius, they can't afford it. Part of the reason they can't afford it, especially if you're going to build new homes, little homes are going to be very expensive per square foot. Because you've got to go through the same business with the planning, the development, the surveying, all that other engineering stuff.
It's gonna be a lot more popular in like the city of Syracuse and other places, yeah.
But you also start with a problem. You're using the wordings, a small multiple family. The net definition of family has changed considerably. And I think the town ordinances should change accordingly as well. We're not going to be forcing people to get married in order to be a quote big family. So the town ordinance ought to change
That's a fact thing. That's
To,
wonderful.
to accommodate that.
Some different terminology you're using. Do you have some new terminology that you come up with?
You could always come up with
We'll
something.
work on that, right?
Occupants and owners.
So, and then we talked briefly about the multi-story with the business on the first floor and the apartments above. We definitely need to develop a greater detail on that than what, because we really don't have anything.
Yeah, we're limited to how many stories we can go, aren't we, somewhat? Based on the size.
I think it's in the code, yeah.
Oh, I'm not-
But I think the mixed use, we really need to modify our town code and incorporate mixed use.
Mixed use.
Because mixed use is the wave of the future. And
So Resorts Lifestyles is, the medical center is the tallest building in
Mhm.
town. But Resorts Lifestyle, I believe, is actually 4 stories. It's 3, but then the roof is really
Yeah,
another,
yeah.
it's because all the utilities and everything, it's really a 4th story.
Houses 3 levels.
yeah, they condescend to 3, telling us it was 3 stories.
It's pretty tall.
Hardly even notice it.
That building fits into the landscape perfectly. I think it's a great looking building. It fits in the landscape and it really accommodates the elderly. We ought to be happy with what we've done for the seniors.
I've talked to the managers over there and they seem to be always at 100% occupancy too.
Well, they have lists.
Oh, and they do community activities too.
Oh, a lot.
They do a lot, yeah.
Yeah.
Listen,
Many
did you-
organizations.
Did you want to say something?
I'll just wonder, is there anything in the code that would prevent tax credit, like developers that apply for tax credits to come in here and build? So you could get, they would have investors that would give the developers money, and then they could apply for tax credits for that. So like we had people in here that would make 60% of the area median income or 80% of the area median income. And then that could also really help with the affordability aspect of it.
I don't think we have anything like that.
I don't think it's anything we
I'm
can.
pretty sure we don't have anything.
Conjo's never come
Subsidized
here.
housing with
Negotiate one
vouchers
of those.
that we have around here, but I mean.
Well, I know we can
do.
we can do IDA, but what you're talking about is a different program.
Through the IRS, it's an IRS program.
That would be more, yeah, likely with the IRS, not so much local municipality control.
No, it's an IRS program that you apply.
For housing, yeah, okay,
Yeah,
so,
for housing.
well, why don't we look into that as part of this planning, because maybe there's something we could say that it would be, again, talking to the developers.
It could be a mixed use, it could be a mixed income property, so you have a market rate in there, and then you would have some lower income ones in there by lower income, I mean, like 60% AMI or 80% AMI, maybe
Because
30% of their income.
Are you familiar with the Holly Green Street neighborhood? That's what they did, when that got all rehab the first time years ago, that was all tax credits. And the investors took the credit
For 15
in exchange for the money.
Right, so they would get like a.
And then they were happy. They gave the money and then they got credits for 15 years on their taxes. That was worth it.
It's a nice.
So you could partner with like Christopher Community or Housing Visions to apply for them. And they would find an investor and a developer, they would buy those credits, and then those investors would claim those credits on their taxes for 10 or 15 years, depending on how the deal was made. And that money would be used to build these properties for a lower rent, and that's how the development would end up being affordable for those patio homes that you were talking about, that weren't affordable, for the ranches that weren't necessarily affordable to do. But then you could also have market rate apartments in there too. I mean, no, I'm not talking about having people in there that's like $13,000 a year income. I mean, it's 60% AMI, 80% AMI, which is really high levels of income you could apply for. I mean, you'd have to have a group of people to figure out what deal would work best for whatever kind of development you're doing, and to figure out how many units you would put into this development and everything. Because it could be all different as well, for how you would do it, depending on how many units you do, 50, 20 units, 50 units, about 10. How you do single family homes, even you could do an apartment building, it would all depend on how you want to do it.
Because they call that for seniors too.
Right, you could, yeah, you could specify for seniors, you would absolutely need to include a certain amount of percentage of units retrofitted for hearing and vision impaired people, and for mobility impaired people as well, because that's a requirement through this program as well in there. But I mean, it's definitely something, as long as it's not prohibited in our code,
Yeah, my only thing is that it's an awful lot of hoops to jump through. I don't know if it's still with the developers, everybody.
Call up Northstar, call up NRV, and guarantee
I
you they
think
were
it's-
fighting at the chops to get into Manlius to do something like this. I would be shocked if they didn't want to
Thank you.
be the first company in the town of Manlius to try to get something like this off the ground.
I didn't hear a word you just
I
said.
said, call up Northstar, call up NRP, call up Rochester Commercial Group, call up any of those kind of developers. I would be shocked if they weren't fighting at their chops to get into the town of Manlius to do a program like this. You were the first developers in this town.
This is photos, I don't know.
He did, has experience with it too. So he makes it some residents that work, that are bankers on these sorts of deals.
The Smith, yeah, Keith Dillagars does it, Key thing. You know the Smith Restaurant Building?
Yeah.
The one of the
They have a tax rate over there.
Smith Restaurant on the boulevard you're talking about?
No,
Yeah.
the old building.
Yeah, not down on the boulevard, right there next to.
Yep, the red, all painted red, they
Yeah.
The old
rehabbed it.
one you're talking about?
They
Oh, okay.
rehabbed it and put in all new
Well,
windows.
they-
and
you get a
everything.
lot of,
Some of that has tax credits in it.
the city gets an awful lot of these type of tax credits.
Well, they're thinking ahead to when the highway isn't there and they may
Right.
know the value.
Right,
But
I've
it's not the
spoken with
municipality,
people.
it's the developer who gets the.
The developer gets the tax credits.
So it's just,
And
we
they-
would have to
and
just
they
permit
sell
them.
it to an investor, and that's the investor, I want to say, for one of the development deals we did, we got $1.06 for on the dollar for every,
Who gives them the tax credit?
the IRS.
Right, and so they would have to apply to the IRS for
We
those
have
credits.
to apply, yes. We do all that stuff. You partner with Housing Visions or Christopher Community or even the Manlius Village Housing Authority. Like I do this.
Okay.
Not
So
that,
thank
not
you.
that I just am very familiar with the process of it and everything. You partner with people to do that stuff. Make some phone calls.
You know what?
I'm not saying you guys specifically, I'm saying like you as in general.
I heard that you wanted to know about whether our existing code includes, would prevent us from doing that. And that's so, I feel like we need to answer that question. And then if it's already with you, we'd love to take your information and make sure we put it into the housing,
Into the action plan.
into the action plan we have around the housing to look at, explore.
That would make sense.
Yeah.
So then the final one on this list, go ahead, yes.
Before we go on to the last one, has there been conversation in regards to the role the town and planning board has in assisting homeowners of existing homes to prevent blight? You heard of the shit up program? did you know? No, but has the comprehensive plan?
So we've spent, yes, we've talked about it. Yeah, that's a great idea. So again, we should put Alyssa's suggestion in there and top of it to follow up on. But also, we've talked about it in the context of sustainability because there are so many programs that homeowners can access but they're kind of difficult to navigate. So if we make it easier for people to know, hey, you can get this kind of, you need new windows anyway, you're gonna get a upgrade, here's what's going on with roofs and insulation and all the rest of it. But beyond that, sort of the Main Street grant program that the county did with ARPA funding was great for the facades and the beautification of commercial properties.
I understand, but if you think about
We don't have one of those.
preserving what Sarah said earlier
Mhm.
about if it's used for farming, leave it as farming, if it's forest, leave it as forest, and then you go on and talk about all this development.
But what about,
That's kind of two things that don't quite match, but for
That's
example,
That's where we are.
like Mattydale is an example. Those homes were built 80, and they necessarily weren't meant to live that long. And it's getting to the point where you're losing homes or something's got to be done. And homes, there are smaller, less expensive homes in the villages of Fayetteville and Manlius mostly, but overlap with the town's responsibility to, I don't know what the answer is, but just to look at these homes that are aging out. I mean, the ones that are 200 years old, they're probably doing better than the ones that are 60 years old. Post World War II, those homes were not built with the quality to last. So what responsibility or just conversation does the comprehensive plan have to not have scuba houses, we call You know, they've got the red and the X,
Oh, yeah.
that because the fire department doesn't have to come anymore, they're not. And I know Village of Manlius, Pleasant Street, Smith Street. And I read an article recently, or the village meeting with the mayor world of what was being done over there and what can be done, or I don't know what the answers are, but I think you've got to look at that, especially if you've got.
No, I thank you for sharing that, because I think that you do see those red X's around, and if you go out more into sort of more rural areas, it's not an area where you necessarily go by a lot, but you can see that the barn's already down and the house is going. And,
We've talked about the land bank. And so we're also eligible to be a part of it. So for properties that have gone so far beyond regular repair, that kind of thing. So the land bank is one area of conversation we have.
So if they're tax delinquent, then the town has authority. But until they're tax delinquent, you really don't have much.
No, we can't do, well, there's a couple things. If they're code non-compliant,
So you
they can
hold
be
their
condemned,
occupancies.
but that doesn't do anything with it. It just makes it fall down by itself.
Right.
And then if it's tax delinquent,
I think the grant, making it easier for people to access the programs that exist is one of the things we could do. So I think whether it's a shape up program or, whatever it is.
and it preserves housing stock, because what we don't want is that house to go out of the market and then have even less homes fewer homes available.
And like the historic district, that's not a problem because it's the registered historic, or they have, everybody sees that. It's the ones that are getting older, that weren't maybe that well built, that are good houses for middle income people to live in villages and town, rather than putting another whatever, or another small development someplace that used to be just taking care of what's already there. And I just didn't see that
Okay.
covered in.
Appreciate that.
So the last one was agricultural and open space. And we do have some farms, and we want to make sure that the farms, as long as those families are willing to keep doing it, we want them to continue to be able to.
I wonder what's gonna happen when they can't afford the gas to run the farms,
Hopefully that's temporary.
and then they're run out of money.
So in Kirkville, I believe over the town line, or over the county line, I think in Madison County, is this Salt City or Harvest Farm, or the Salt City Farm. Here's an example of agricultural folks who lease land to this program where, new Americans and refugees that are growing things can come together. It's a great program. But backing away from that specific example, what I see in that is this idea of subdividing and leasing people who want community gardens. Maybe they just want to work on a smaller area, just keeping up with the opportunities that are there within like cooperative farming for our food, keeping food as local as possible, because it is expensive to ship too. So I think that beekeeping, all the things that many more people we know have chickens, but all those things. But I think that we talked about solar as a concept around supporting people for land banking in some ways, and thinking that there's some land that is banked just by nature of being part of a solar project for 25 years, that it's not disturbing the ground so that it could go back to an agricultural use. We discussed that, and we support the, what is the program called that puts the land into a trust too. So we're supportive of those applicants, those farming parks that are applying for those.
CNY Trust.
They're conservation easements. Yeah, so
Is it not CNY Land Trust? Not
no,
that,
this
not
is
for
an
profit.
agricultural program with
Within
the
New York
state,
State.
and they actually, New York State will
farmland.
It will preserve their, it will pay them to keep their farmland farmland.
When the gas is.
Exactly.
So it's feasible for them to keep it as it is and not sell it to the developer.
It just insulates certain properties from being,
Right.
So
The incentive to sell it to a developer has got to be huge for some of these farmers.
Sarah, can you just explain, rethink our rate of default zone? Just
So we were thinking, and we haven't, is having residential, having restricted agriculture be more agricultural, like take more things out of it and say, if you're gonna be that, it's really gonna mean open fields. And if you're something, if they were gonna make a different zone, that would be for those in-between uses. Right now, RA is very expansive of what's permitted.
it's like this assumption you're definitely gonna be a farmer if you're nothing else.
Oh, I see what you're saying.
And so we would make RA more restrictive, as restricted agricultural, and make a new zone of this transitional area.
So more restricted where they're actually farming.
They're actually farming or some other, grassy activity. And not having so many sort of businessy type uses that are still permitted within our.
Is that gonna run head on into the solar farms?
Probably, that would be an area of something where I'd say, is that really agricultural? And in a way it is, because it's preserving the land, but the neighbors don't perceive it that way.
I know.
The
So,
neighbors that
As
can
we all
view it.
know very well.
The neighbors that can view it.
yeah, so that would be an example.
Yeah. I was just curious.
So I am sensitive to time and I have more questions for you, so I want to run through real quickly. So do you have some land use challenges that you have struggled with over the last few years that you'd like the comprehensive plan to address?
Yes.
Okay.
We have been told that this plan is coming.
Mhm.
And we've been looking for some guidance on solar development, particular target areas
Mhm.
that the town would be thinking would be more appropriate for solar development. We've been told, we talked about farmland and then maintaining farmland. In fact, the last solar development, we had people come in and say, do not approve this. We want the farmland to be farmland. And we said, well, that's great, and we understand this, but you can't force someone to engage in an occupation on their property. But we're trying to determine what target areas you have for that. And if you in fact have target areas for particular zoning. One thing that is a major problem for me is spot zoning. This town has engaged in spot zoning from time to time. That spot zoning opens the door. It's a slippery slope. Once you engage in spot zoning, you're kind of stuck with what you've done. And the next person to come along and say they want spot zoning has a valid argument as to why they're being mistreated. I'm not at all in favor of spot zoning. And I'd like to see something more statutory from our town regarding that.
Can you explain spot?
So we change the zone on one particular parcel so that they can do something different that
Say
they
no
want.
more.
I thought though, I know Tim has always been a proponent against spot zoning too, for Tuscaloosa. And I always thought that the planning board was really following avoiding spot zoning in these developments. Am I mistaken?
No, we have. We have, but I have seen occurrences where we have said no and the town board has changed and has gone along with the zone change, authorizing.
Oh, what was that?
How about the ice cream shop down on 173?
Is that recently?
Are you talking about?
What was it, 5 or 6 years ago? Maybe
Oh.
6 or 7 years ago. I don't know.
Was that where we changed it to RT? There was a
Yes,
chocolate shop.
The residential transition.
And that was,
Right,
we changed it to
Andrews Road,
RT.
Yes.
That's really.
And if I'm mistaken, Tim was not the town attorney at that time.
We created the RT zoning classification, and that's the only place
And it was,
It's the only place with it, so it's spot zoning.
The place just outside the village of Manlius?
It
Oh,
is.
yeah.
yeah, it was right
Yeah,
outside.
right outside, right outside.
South Village, now I know.
Yeah. I remember that.
We're arguing over that, yes.
That was a Western part.
We've had some problems with council before. Not current council, but we had one council who told us property was particularly zoned for trailer sales. And I questioned him and said, that's not my interpretation. My reading of the statute is really wrong. And he said, it's a dead issue. It is okay. And
Yeah,
you have no
I remember that too.
You have nothing further you can say about it.
Yeah.
I should never have shut up that night.
Is that the one on 290?
Yeah. Which is all cleared out.
Yeah.
It's not there, but- Yeah, that became an issue when Tim returned. this time.
Yes.
And the difference, sometimes some people don't understand the difference between the overlay district and spot zoning.
Oh,
So,
right, that is different.
yeah, so do we want to clarify what that would be for folks on the Zoom? The difference between overlay district and spot zoning?
You're better with overlay than I am.
Well, as I understand it, it's something that is a use that doesn't fundamentally change any of the zone underneath it, basically, but is something that just isn't included in the
Give us an
existing.
example of it.
We talked about one of these the other day.
I know the one that we might have taken it out of the code when we did the last revision, but it was in the code. There was an overlay for a technology development on Kirkville Road. And it was an overlay that you could basically, if the owner came and said, I want to do this thing, it was for Lockheed or Census or one of those, and they wanted to have radar things on them. So to permit them to do that, because normally radars are not permitted, they had an overlay district for that commercial lot to say, if you come here, you may do this thing with this overlay district.
And it goes away
When
once
they
that
When they
exists.
remove the.
It doesn't stay with the land, it leaves.
Then it
for
goes
the-
back to its original zone.
Yeah,
That was a long time ago.
yeah, we always talk about it sometimes in deliberations, like we're gonna do, we haven't done one since I've been counselor,
That was
but
a long time ago.
yeah.
But I think one of the examples that came up was what some other towns have done, is done an overlay for solar.
Mhm.
So it doesn't stay with the land, it's permitted only for whatever lot you put the overlay on, and in 25 years it evaporates. I believe that's what Ponte did.
Can't go to Sweet Road now without seeing all the signs that say no solar on Sweet
Right.
Road.
So, but that's an example of an overlay district.
Thank you, I started the conversation, but I did need a little help finishing it. That's really helpful.
So another thing, did you? want to-
Oh, I had a quick question for Joe after that. You mentioned the challenges were definitely guidance on solar development. I was wondering if the information we can get access to around what three-phase power exists and what National Grid says our load is something you should
Talking
have.
about the grid.
Yeah,
Yeah.
you should actually know where these developers would never want to go because of just the utilities.
Yes,
I think if you don't have that, we need to make sure you have that.
we have that.
Okay, you have that. So,
I have that.
okay.
Joe has it.
So do you think you'd like to submit and make sure that the comprehensive plan committee is you're recommending boundaries for future developments to be, you know,
Yeah.
within that zone?
In fact, I think the town ought to be aware of the host capacity mapping. And it's readily available by National Grid. It's on the internet.
Yeah.
And we are quickly reaching maximum capacity.
Exactly.
And
Well, I think that's
that
what
says
we,
it all.
that's what we understand our guardrails to be, I think, as a community, that there's,
Well, I
and to
think
be able to articulate to developers.
we are at maximum capacity now, but the grid should be growing, and in 10 years, will they have more capacity?
Well, it's completely
Absolutely.
it's completely dependent upon the infrastructure choices and money funds that happen now for the next 10 years. And those funds are not coming to us anytime soon. Like, we can see that they're not, we've got at least, there can be repairs, but our top issues are also going to be around our sewer. I feel like if you want, yeah, we'll see what the utilities are gonna do, but the utilities are not moving faster than we are, that's for sure.
And I agree with you about sewer, yes, it's being a challenge.
Yeah.
Talking about sanitary or stormwater?
Sanitary, well, both of them, but sanitary, we're already on a chargeback basis, and we're running out of, to the next level of that, to where
But isn't that where limestone is supposed to be expanding?
well, they said they were gonna fix it next year, so hopefully that will happen.
Right.
I don't know if you heard that, but
No, I
the
was.
renovation of,
The county's been working.
the renovation of the Meadowbrook limestone is supposed to be scheduled for next year,
Okay.
and that should help the immediate problem, but we still have to have greater sewer capacity. And we keep building new things here, and they all go.
Kind of promise.
There's a
Who's just the fellow, that nice guy that you put on the planning board that's an engineer, but he was into sewers and he's with the county now.
Oh, I know who you mean. Mental.
Yeah.
Oh,
Frank
Frank.
Mental.
Oh, Frank,
Yeah.
oh, Frank, yeah.
He was gonna do something before he left.
Mhm.
And had to do something with, up on Penbury Road.
Yeah, I
That'll
don't
change.
know what he did
Yeah,
though.
I know.
He missed the last several meetings of the board.
So we have a question on the Zoom.
Yes, Mark Stambro asked, would the quarry rezoning be considered spot zoning or an overlay change?
So
That's a good question.
that's an interesting question, because theoretically it could be an overlay, but it's 100-year overlay.
Yeah, right.
And you can't ever make it not a quarry again,
Yeah.
so it's gotta be a permanent land use. So, no, it can't be an overlay. A quarry has to be a permanent land use, because
It wouldn't be a spot though either, because it would be next door to the same thing. He asked if it would be spot zoning or.
But if
overlay.
a new quarry would be a new land.
Right, but it wouldn't be in the category of spot zoning, because it would be, if it was approved, it would be next door to a similar use.
No.
No,
Not
Oh,
on
because
Gulf
that's
Road.
gonna be,
Not on Gulf Road.
There's a bit of,
There's a lot
in
of-
between.
it's called, what was the name of the zone that we're looking at?
Resource removal.
Research, right. I don't think there's anything else there that meets that same
Yeah.
zone.
So the question
It's
is,
all RA.
would that
Okay.
property be, so the question is, you would be zoning a single property, because it would be by then a single property.
Yeah.
Huge, but a single property. And you wouldn't want to zone more than what's needed. So you wouldn't make like the whole neighborhood resource development.
No,
So.
and you're right too, Sarah, that we did talk about overlay.
Mhm.
Um, whatever, 200 years.
But you can never put the stone back.
To RA? Something will go there again.
Well, something will grow there.
Those are your grandkids' kids you're talking about. Don't forget,
They're
it's
gonna
not that far
be,
away.
they're gonna get the advantage of all the rocks and stones.
They're gonna be here
provided
in
by
200 years.
those-
They're gonna be here in 200 years. They can tell you what's happening.
Right.
So I think that the question is, it would be a single property that would be zoned for resource removal. And you wouldn't want it to be a whole street.
I just never thought of it as the spot zone. That's really interesting. I never thought of it that
I
way.
would have to look at that.
Would that be considered?
Thank you for the question.
Would that be considered sponsor?
I think it all depends on how it conforms with the adjoining properties and what all the adjoining properties are zoned. Yeah.
How many acres is that?
250.
Not all at once. though.
No, it's gonna take 100 years.
Yeah, it's gonna take a while.
So I don't want to keep you guys on that. Is there anything that was a special use permit or not permitted that sticks in your mind that it was inappropriate or overly restricted? where the code was written so that where people had to jump through too many hoops.
I don't think so. I don't think we have, no.
The one example I had, do you guys remember the massage therapists on Kirkville Road where they had to get a special use permit?
Yes.
To do that one room in their house? That seemed a bit much to
It
me.
was an older couple. It was a very older couple.
Yeah, I remember that. Did that go through?
It
Yeah.
went through, but it was,
Yeah.
they had to come, like, it seemed like it was, the special use permit was more than what really should have been necessary for that utilization. And I just wondered, I'm going back to my home occupations thing, because somebody might have appointments with people 2 or 3 times a day, does that really infringe on their neighbors?
Well, I think given the fact that massage places are also notable these days for potential human trafficking activities, not that I'm thinking anything about this couple. But no, but I mean, it is one industry that's attached to often operations that are not completely transparent. And lots of different individuals. I'm choosing my words carefully. But and by the way, love massage therapists, love spas. Please
I'm
love
high
them.
maintenance too, don't feel bad.
But yeah, but all I'm saying is that maybe that's another angle to reason why you want to have regulation for something that's like a
I don't
human
think they have
service.
too much.
Was it about traffic at all? Because I know there's probably one person at a time every couple hours.
Yeah, that was the
That's
issue.
it.
And that's the
And
thing.
the parking and, yeah.
It was, that's what, and basically that's why it was required. basically.
Yeah,
Even
right.
the other
There'd
ones.
be traffic on, so for your attorney's office that you didn't, that they didn't want you to permit, if you had, I mean, you could have clients, 2 or 3 clients coming in a day, that you don't, but you could have.
The could. Yep. But we didn't.
Right.
It was just sitting there, me, typing things and doing things, and yeah. And I think that's the breaker is depends on what type of volume you have. And if it's a service thing where you can only have one person at a time, that's more inclined. I think our statute is very well defined, perhaps too well defined. It permits doctors and lawyers and dentists and things of that nature, and it could be broader to encompass other types of home occupations that are not incorporated.
Yeah, that makes sense.
So the statute itself could possibly be revised to include a broader range.
Good, that would be good.
And the planning board would not have a problem with special use permit, as long as there's no traffic issues.
And parking issues.
We haven't said anything about cannabis. Sorry, that was one of your questions.
You can't have a meeting without mentioning cannabis.
Sorry.
So,
But can I?
can we require a special use permit for that? I don't think we did.
No, I just wanted to make clear my understanding as a counselor looking at the comprehensive plan. New York State, it's gonna have their rules. We did not opt out of the New York State rules. So I, as a person who has constituents and care about, air quality and the same way that tobacco and alcohol are regulated in this community within the town, is the guidepost I use for, I assume we're using for cannabis.
Yeah.
And so that means, the same rules against being close to parks and schools and, all the rest of it. That's what I'm going, so I just wanted to find out if you had any conversations at the planning board level.
We have had absolutely no conversations
Yeah.
whatsoever
Right.
regarding this topic.
In fact, I think a lot of it is because we were still waiting for the state to put
Right.
their board together.
Which they have now done,
They finally did, but they still have to expand that,
and their board has to do something.
right?
Is
So
there,
before
Yeah, is
even
there
come to
training
us,
or-
there's really hardly anything we can do.
well, I would say is there train, especially as we're putting together the budget.
I think we should talk to
And
Amy.
there's gonna be zoning.
And we can, if you want the planning board to have any sort of access to anybody or discussions or workshops or trainings or anything like that, I mean, we are willing to educate ourselves, but I know that I would want to support making sure you had what you needed.
Well, the zoning's gonna be important, whether it's zoning allowed industrial or
If it's commercial.
whatever.
Yes. Something like that would be a commercial enterprise,
Yeah.
and it would bring a volume of people.
Well,
And I only know it because coming back from Old Forge, we came across a bunch of little kids with a little lemonade stand.
Mhm.
And immediately after them was a marijuana stand.
Hopefully not kids.
You do have to be 21.
Yes,
So that's,
it's a changing world.
Yeah.
But then whether or not you can have a dispensary also, that's part of the board's decision, I think, dispensary or and just a lounge.
The lounge.
One or the
Both
other.
are permitted currently, but
Right,
I don't know that anybody will develop the lounge.
Yeah.
The business model for that is somewhat sketchy in my mind.
I know we weren't too happy about the lounge thing.
I think the money things are gonna be a discussion.
Yeah, throw it all up.
But I think the money's gonna be more dispensary more so than a lounge.
Yes.
So before we wrap up, is there anything else that anybody wants to share or ask about? Anybody else on Zoom who has a question?
I'm good.
Sure, thank you.
Thank you very much, and thank you for having thought about some of your suggestions of things to do. And we will incorporate your suggestions into our plan.
So we want to thank the town board for coming and presenting this today. And we are looking for guidance and to know that our intentions and our plans are in conformity with what the town foresees as the future of the town. And
You don't need a motion to adjourn, do you? Because it's just an open meeting without.
technically we do, but
So.
I'll make a motion. to adjourn.
second by Ernie. All in favor? Aye. We stand adjourned.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for coming.